Good morning and welcome to our continuing series called Wisdom for Living Life Well, where we explore the book of James and mine it for all the little treasures and nuggets of wisdom the book has to offer, so that we may enter into the fullness of what God has for us. Today we're going to be pondering the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? Or what does it mean to be a spiritual person? I had to ask myself the same question a few years ago when a friend of mine from overseas came by. He saw that we were now Christian, well, he heard at least that we were now Christian, and he started asking me a few questions. I thought it was obvious. We started going to church, we started praying before meals, we were being relatively loving in my eyes, but he asked me a very poignant question. He's like, okay, so you're a Christian now, what does that actually mean? And to me, I thought it was clear. I go to church, I pray, I do all these nice things. And he says, yes, but how has your life changed? Like, how are you different as a person? And I thought to myself, well, that's not a fair question, buddy. I thought it's pretty clear. I'm praying. I'm like, oh, but there's more to it than that, isn't there? He noticed that while I'm saying I'm a Christian, my lifestyle didn't necessarily change all that much. And James, in the same manner, asks us those poignant questions. So today we'll be exploring this very idea of what does it mean to be a Christian? And to give you the short answer already ahead of time, we see that scripture tells us that you will know a tree by its fruit. And today we're going to unpack a passage in James which talks about the relationship between faith, and the word we're going to use to describe faith today, which is synonymous with faith and belief in Greek, is trust. So what does trust in God entail, and what does it look like? And we're going to unpack this question from James 2:14 to 26. James begins by writing, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' You believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, 'Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness.' And he was called a friend of God." You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messages and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Before we delve into the big ideas of the passage, it's important to take a moment to just remind ourselves who James is and why he's writing what he's writing. So James is the half-brother of Jesus, and he's currently the head of the church in Jerusalem, and he's writing to a bunch of Jewish Christians scattered across the Mediterranean. They've been pressured both externally and internally. Externally, they were being persecuted by various governments in which they found themselves and by their own religious leaders, whereas the internal pressure came from internal inconsistencies, things that weren't going well with them with regards to their belief or their faith or their trust in God. So James makes every effort to remind them of what it means to be authentic, and that's one of the big themes we see across the book of James: authenticity, impartiality. And he goes at length now to remind those that if you hear, you believe, you also ought to do. The main thought that James tries to bring across here is that faith apart from works is dead, which means that trusting God without a lifestyle that matches is ultimately useless. We're going to explore 4 big ideas today. And the first idea we're going to explore is what is faith, or what is trusting God, and what is its purpose. James begins this passage by writing, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters?" And let's just pause there for a second. That phrase, "what good is it?" is a key phrase to understand the rest of this passage, because James sets the tone of what his idea is. Faith is supposed to benefit others. That's the first idea he seems to be conveying. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? So off the bat, James makes a connection. Faith or belief or trust in God ought to lead in a lifestyle that follows. He asks, can that faith save him? And then he brings across a very, very practical example of what faith ought to look like. So, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So off the bat, he makes a very, very poignant and clear example of what faith ought to look like. Someone comes with a very practical need, and the response of this supposedly spiritual person is, "Oh, just go in peace, be filled, be warmed, be satisfied." It's just well-wishing in that case. He seems to think that there is obviously a response that's more appropriate if you see someone in need. And he also says, so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And this phrase is repeated again at the end of the passage. And the idea that he's trying to convey is that faith ought to give life. There's a purpose to faith. Faith on one hand, or trust in God, roots you into a life-giving relationship with him. And out of this life-giving relationship with him, we are designed and called to give life to others out of that relationship of grace and love. As an example of what this kind of supposedly spiritual person would look like, imagine, if you would, you were walking down the steps one day and you suddenly trip, graze your knee, and it looks quite bad and gnarly. It's sore, so you want to go to the doctor to get it checked out. While at the doctor has a look at it and says, "You know what, just think positively and it will be much better." I'm sure that you will be scratching your head and looking at this doctor as if though he was smoking something very, very, very strong. Surely the best thing would be to do the thing I came to you for. I'm in need. Why don't you help me with what you know you can do? Why don't you give me an x-ray? Why don't you give me some antibiotics, some pain medication? If you end up in that kind of situation, you'll be left with two thoughts. A, this guy clearly doesn't know what he's doing. But secondly, you'll be asking yourself, is this even a doctor at all? And we're going to explore this idea a bit more. Because James stresses that, again, as we mentioned earlier, a tree is known by its fruit. Likewise, the way we behave, the way we interact with others, will be evidence of what we believe. The second idea that James wants to highlight is that knowing and thereby trusting in God ought to lead to action. He begins verse 18 by saying, and introducing a hypothetical objector, someone that's merely there to bounce off a few ideas and set up his argument. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works." James then replies, "Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." So he challenges this hypothetical objector who seems to think that, it's enough to know the right things about God and you're good. How can one see what you believe apart from you just merely telling people? He challenges this person to show their faith apart from doing anything, without doing anything, and he will show them his faith by the way he lives. Just think about it for a second. It's impossible to show what you believe without doing anything. Just try it. Try and demonstrate your belief without doing anything. I don't know if you tried, but I'm sure that you would agree with me that it's impossible to do so. He goes on to address the idea then of just having the right idea about God is enough. You believe that God is one, you do well. This is a good thing. But he sets them up then with this phrase, and a scary one at that. Even the demons believe and shudder. So we can all wax lyrical about many points of Christian doctrine or belief or whatever it is. We can all say that we believe something. What separates us from his example here is the way we live and the way we respond to what we know. Right knowing and right thinking about God ought to lead to trust, and trust ought to lead us into a lifestyle which reflects what we hold dear and what we value. He uses two examples then from the Old Testament to undergird his point: Abraham and Rahab. Abraham, who's considered the father of the faith, a very faithful man, demonstrated his faith when he was willing to offer up his son Isaac. Paul says that because of this, you can clearly see that this man had faith. He then used the example of Rahab, the prostitute, who, when her city was under siege, helped two Israelite spies to escape. Once again showing that she trusted in God and she responded in kind. There is a need to know the good things about God, but it's not enough if it doesn't lead to a change in lifestyle. James wants to do away with that kind of notion of what faith or trust in God ought to look like, because that allows us, if we simply know the right thing and we know how to say it, well, it can easily lead us to paint a veneer of spirituality, a veneer of Christianity, without ever really putting on the full picture. It's easy to put a Coke label on a milk bottle, but the fact of the matter is, the milk won't magically become Coke because of it. And in the same way, James points out that it's easy to adopt spiritual lingo simply because you know more. What's needed is a transformation and a change in one's lifestyle. Moving on, and this is the third thought we need to clear up, because for me it sticks out a bit like a sore thumb, and that's verse 24. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. This seems to completely contradict what we know about the Apostle Paul, who teaches that one is only justified or made right with God by faith and not by works. James seems to be flat out contradicting him. Well, the fact of the matter is, James and Paul are in much more agreement than we can see on the surface level. If we just compare some of what they teach and what they say, we'll see that they're actually in complete agreement. Firstly, we see that James, again, going back to verse 14, is always asking the question, how does your faith, how does your trust in God benefit someone else? He has an outward look towards what faith is. Paul, on the other hand, speaks of faith and justification as the means of trusting God's provision on the cross for us. That while we were still sinners, Christ died for us so that we can be made right with him. Are they contradicting each other? Far from it. If anything, both Paul and James highlight that in order to be made right with God, we need to keep the whole law. But they also both point out that it's impossible to keep the whole law. For if we mess up even once, then we are culpable for all of it. That's why we need grace. And James even encourages people to draw near to God and so to receive grace in order to be made right with him. We can't be made right with God by works. And James is not saying you cannot be made right with God through works. Yet, we can see that they also use the word justify a bit differently. We can see that through the examples even of Abraham that they both use. Both Paul and James use the example of Abraham to demonstrate that faith is key to coming to know God. But faith in the example of Abraham looks like him responding to God's call. So Paul uses the example of Abraham while he was still in Ur of the Chaldeans, where he heard the call of God and responded to him. That's right before he was even known as Abraham. That was while he was known as Abram. James uses the example towards the end of Abraham's life, once he had his son and once he had already established himself. He says that his faith was evident in the fact that he was offering up his son. Both of them are right. Paul speaks about the fact that trust in God is sufficient in order to be made right with him. James echoes this by saying, and since you've placed your trust in God, what you do and the way you live will become evidence of what you believe. Think of it this way. Paul describes the root of the tree while James focuses on the fruit. Paul speaks of the inward reality which will become manifest one day, which will become clear to see, whereas James speaks of the outward reality of people looking in so that they can see what is actually happening in us. Paul as well would think that works go hand in hand with faith, for he wouldn't promise us in Ephesians 2 verse 10 that we are Christ's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. The fact of the matter is, my dear friend, we cannot separate faith or belief or trust in God, whatever you want to call it, from the way we live. The way we live will ultimately evidence what we hold dear. And coming back to that illustration of the tree, I want us to go into John 15 for our final thought. Just as we see here, we can be made righteous only through trusting in God, but that righteousness becomes clear to see by abiding faith. John 15 verses 1 to 4 read, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Going on to verse 5, it says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. And we land here on this passage to help illustrate and ground what James is echoing throughout that passage we just read. We are saved or made right with God for a purpose. In other words, our faith has a purpose. It is to connect us to the source of life, and in so doing, give life to those around us. We are described as the branches and Jesus as the true vine, the source of life we are designed to be in. Yet, as much as a branch might try, there's no way, if it is removed from the source of life, it could ever place itself back into that same source. We need the help of the vine dresser to graft us back in to the source of life. And once we are placed back into this connection, into this relationship, into this newfound dynamic of trusting in the source of life, the lover of our souls, we are able to bear much fruit. You can't separate trust or faith in God from the way we live, but we need that abiding trust in Him in order to do anything which pleases Him. We are designed to bear fruit, and that's what James is saying. We can't separate what we believe from what we do, because that's not how we're designed. We're designed to bear fruit, to abide and to bear fruit, to be rooted in that knowledge, going back to what we described Paul and James as doing, that illustration of a tree. We can be rooted in the knowledge that we have been made right with God because of the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And out of that, we are able to draw upon grace and grace and grace so that we can continue to bear fruit. So, coming back to the question of what makes a Christian, well, simply put, it's a lifestyle in which it is visible that we as branches bear fruit. And the question then is, okay, we need faith, and faith isn't simply agreeing to a new set of ideas. Faith isn't saying only the right thing, but living the right way. But we can't also do good without Him. So how does this dynamic work? Jesus teaches us that we abide. He calls us to abiding relational faith. That's why we use the word trust, because it's not meant to be agreeing to new ideas. It's about trusting a living person. Jesus teaches us we are to wholeheartedly trust in Him, to abide in Him and His love, not rely on our own strength, not rely on other things to satisfy the hole that we need satisfied only by Him. And out of that trust, to willfully and out of a place of joy, obey and respond with a yes, I want to do that because I trust you and I know you. And I know you have what's best in mind for me. To use an illustration that we've been using so far, James acts like the shears of a gardener, the vine dresser in this case, to help prune us that we may bear fruit. God's desire is for us to succeed, and we do that by abiding in Him. So if we see that we have weaknesses or chinks in the armor, holes in our game plan, or we're not seeing fruit in our lives, that's not reason to stop and think, oh, woe is me, I need to try hard. No, it's a call to be honest before Him, to have one of those aha moments which Craig talked about, to acknowledge what's wrong, to honestly admit it before Him and wholeheartedly depend on Him, and finally, through His loving grace, to take action, to take practical steps towards what is needed to be done. We can't be perfected on this side of the eternity. And we can't do it by ourselves, by any means. We know that. God calls us to abide in Him so that we can have wholeness and fruitfulness. So wherever you are and wherever you may be, just know that there's a loving Father calling you to Himself because He desires you to bear much fruit. Bless you. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.